Summer, 1963. The Pinchot family stands on the terraced lawn of gray towers, their ancestral château perched high above the Delaware River Valley in Milford, Pennsylvania. 3 stone towers rise against the Pennsylvania sky, their steep slate roofs catching the afternoon light like a vision transplanted from the Loire Valley. For 77 years, this has been theirs, every stone, every acre, every carefully cultivated tree. Today, they sign it all away to the United States Forest Service, transforming their private paradise into public property, their summer retreat into a symbol. Beautiful, isn't it? The ultimate act of conservation, a wealthy family sacrificing their estate to preserve their father's legacy. But here's what the ceremony doesn't show you: the decades of impossible choices that led to this moment, the mounting costs of maintaining a dream that was never meant to survive its dreamer, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the only way to save a legacy is to let it go. Because Gray Towers isn't just a mansion, it's the birthplace of American forestry, yes, but it's also a monument to a more troubling question. Can you build a dynasty on trees you'll never see grow? Can a vision planted by one generation survive the storms that come for the next? This is the story of the château that tried to save America's forests while struggling to save itself, and the family who discovered that some inheritances are too expensive to keep. Let's start with what everyone sees. Gray Towers sits like a crown on a hilltop overlooking Milford, Pennsylvania, 45 acres of manicured perfection, commanding panoramic views of the Pocono Mountains and the Delaware River Valley below. The main house is a study in European romanticism filtered through American ambition. A French chateau built from Pennsylvania bluestone, its 3 circular towers giving the estate its name, its steep-pitched roofs and Gothic revival details, speaking of old-world sophistication. The architect James Pinchot hired, Richard Morris Hunt, was America's first architect trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the same man who would go on to design the base of the Statue of Liberty and the façade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This wasn't just building a house, it was importing an entire aesthetic philosophy across the Atlantic. The mansion's 44 rooms flow with the kind of casual grandeur that only truly wealthy people can achieve. High ceilings with exposed timber beams, massive stone fireplaces that could swallow a grown man, leaded glass windows that fractured the sunlight into cathedral patterns across Persian rugs and French furniture. The dining room features a custom-built table that could seat 20 guests. The library holds thousands of volumes on forestry, natural history, and European art, and the music room contains a grand piano where Mary Pinchot would play for visiting senators, scientists, and society figures who made the pilgrimage from Philadelphia and New York. But the real showpiece isn't the house, it's the landscape. James Pinchot understood something that many wealthy men of his era missed. A mansion is only as impressive as its setting. So he hired Gifford Pinchot himself, his son, along with landscape architect Ferruccio Vitale, to transform the surrounding forest into what amounted to an outdoor theater of conservation principles. They created the letterbox, a turquoise-painted furniture arrangement around a reflecting pool where the Pinchots would dine outdoors beneath the trees, the food literally lowered from the house above via a dumbwaiter system built into the hillside. They designed the finger bowl, a circular pool where guests would discover their dessert bowls floating in the water like lilies, a whimsical touch that became legendary among the conservation elite who visited. The bait box, a small pavilion, served as a fishing lodge where Theodore Roosevelt himself cast lines and discussed the future of America's national forests with Gifford Pinchot over brandy and cigars. Every path, every planted tree, every stone wall was deliberate. This was forestry as performance art, conservation as social theater. When you walked Gray Towers in its prime, you weren't just seeing wealth, you were seeing a philosophy made visible, the idea that humans could live in harmony with nature if they had enough money, enough land, and enough taste to do it correctly. Now let's talk about what kept this illusion running. Because Gray Towers wasn't just a house, it was an operation, a machine that consumed resources, labor, and constant attention just to maintain the appearance of effortless elegance. The mansion required a permanent staff of at least 12 full-time employees during the summer season when the Pinchots were in residence. Housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, groundskeepers, a chauffeur, stable hands for the horses, and specialized craftsmen to maintain the complex systems James Pinchot had installed. The heating system alone was a marvel of expensive engineering. A coal-fired boiler in the basement fed a network of steam radiators throughout the house, requiring someone to tend the furnace around the clock during the cooler months. The cost of heating gray towers for a single winter could have fed a working-class family for a year. Water had to be pumped uphill from springs and wells using steam-powered pumps, then distributed through custom copper piping to bathrooms, kitchens, and the elaborate outdoor water features. Those charming reflecting pools and finger bowls, they required constant maintenance, regular draining and cleaning, and a sophisticated hydraulic system to keep them filled and level on a hillside that wanted nothing more than to let gravity take everything downhill to the valley below. The forest itself demanded even more attention. This wasn't wilderness. It was a carefully managed demonstration forest, each tree selected and placed according to scientific forestry principles that Gifford Pinchot was pioneering. Professional foresters walked the property daily, marking trees for selective cutting, monitoring for disease and pests, thinning overcrowded areas, and planting new species in experimental plots. The forest was divided into sections, each managed according to different principles to demonstrate various approaches to sustainable forestry. Records were kept meticulously: which trees were cut when, how much timber was harvested, how much regenerated, what the economic yield was per acre compared to the ecological health of the forest. It was forestry as laboratory, and laboratories require technicians. During peak season, gray towers employed up to 30 workers in various capacities, from the elegant interior staff who served formal dinners to the rough-handed foresters who worked the timber tracks to the craftsmen who maintained the stonework and carpentry. The annual operating budget during the early 20th century ran to tens of thousands of dollars, the equivalent of millions today, just to keep the doors open and the grass cut. And then there were the social costs, the exhausting performance of being the Pinchot family. Because Gray Towers wasn't a retreat, it was a stage. James and Mary Pinchot didn't just live here, they hosted, constantly. Scientists, politicians, fellow millionaires, European aristocrats, Yale forestry students, reporters, and curious socialites all made the journey to Milford expecting to be entertained, fed, educated, and impressed. Mary Pinchot, in particular, carried the burden of being the perfect hostess, orchestrating elaborate outdoor dinners, musical performances, and intellectual salons while maintaining the facade that all of this was casual, effortless, just the natural state of refined people living refined lives. She managed the household staff, planned the menus, arranged the flowers, selected the wines, and ensured that every guest left with stories that would enhance the Pinchot reputation in New York and Philadelphia social circles. This was emotional labor on an industrial scale, the constant performance of grace under pressure. When Gifford Pinchot became chief of the Forest Service in 1905, Gray Towers transformed from a private estate into something closer to an unofficial government facility, a place where conservation policy was debated and decided over cognac in the library or during long walks through the demonstration forest. The weight of that legacy, the expectation that Gray Towers would serve as both family home and national monument, was something the Pinchots felt every single day. How do you relax in a house that's also a museum? How do you have a private life when your home is a pilgrimage site for conservationists? To understand Gray Towers, you have to understand James Pinchot. And to understand James Pinchot, you have to understand what it meant to make a fortune in 19th century America, and then wake up one day, horrified by what your generation had destroyed. James was born in 1831, the son of a successful merchant, and he built his wealth the old-fashioned way, through trade, real estate speculation, and shrewd investments in the booming American economy of the post-Civil War era. He made his money in wallpaper manufacturing and interior decorating, supplying the materials that filled the mansions of New York's Gilded Age elite. By his 40s, he was rich enough to retire, sophisticated enough to travel extensively through Europe, and self-aware enough to recognize that American capitalism was consuming the nation's natural resources at a pace that would leave nothing for future generations. During his travels through France, Germany, and Switzerland in the 1870s, James witnessed something that didn't exist in America. Forests managed scientifically, timber harvested sustainably, landscapes that had been productive for centuries because people treated them as long-term investments rather than short-term resources to be exploited and abandoned. He saw German foresters carefully thinning woodlands, French aristocrats managing their estates according to principles developed over generations, Swiss villages where every tree was inventoried and its cutting regulated by local councils. Meanwhile, back in America, the forests were being slaughtered. The great eastern forests that had once stretched unbroken from the Atlantic to the Mississippi were being clear-cut for timber, burned for farmland, destroyed by careless logging practices that left behind eroded hillsides and poisoned streams. James Pinchot, wallpaper millionaire, returned from Europe with an obsession. Someone needed to save what was left of America's forests, and if no one else was going to do it, the Pinchots would. Grey Towers was built in 1886 as the physical manifestation of that obsession. James wasn't just building a summer house, he was creating a monument to what could be, a demonstration that Americans could live among forests without destroying them, that wealth and nature could coexist if managed with intelligence and restraint. He chose the site in Milford specifically because the surrounding forest had been partially logged but not destroyed, giving him the raw material to demonstrate regeneration and sustainable management. He designed the house to be part of the landscape rather than dominating it, the stone towers echoing the surrounding hills, the building materials sourced from local quarries to minimize the estate's footprint. This was idealism made physical, conservation philosophy rendered in bluestone and slate. But James Pinchot was also practical enough to know he couldn't change America's forestry practices alone. He needed an heir, someone young and energetic enough to carry the mission beyond one man's lifetime. That heir was his son, Gifford. Gifford Pinchot was born in 1865, and from childhood, his father groomed him for a very specific destiny. While other wealthy sons were being prepared to manage family businesses or enter politics or simply live well off their inheritances, Gifford was being trained to become America's first professional forester. At 24, with James's encouragement and financial support, Gifford traveled to Europe to study scientific forestry, first in France at the École Nationale Forestière, then in Switzerland and Germany, learning techniques that were centuries old in Europe but completely unknown in America. He returned in 1890 with a radical idea. American forests could be harvested for profit without being destroyed, but it required patience, planning, and a completely different relationship with the land. At Grey Towers, father and son began putting these ideas into practice, transforming the estate's forests into the country's first demonstration of sustainable forestry. They didn't just plant trees, they studied them. They didn't just harvest timber, they calculated the optimal cutting cycle. They kept records, published papers, invited other wealthy landowners to visit and learn. Grey Towers became a classroom, and Gifford Pinchot became America's first forestry evangelist, preaching a gospel of conservation that put him at odds with the timber barons, railroad magnates, and politicians who saw the nation's forests as nothing more than raw material to be liquidated for profit. But here's the beautiful irony. The Pinchots were selling conservation to the American elite from a mansion that most Americans could never afford to visit, let alone own. They were advocating for public land management while living on a private estate so exclusive that you needed a personal invitation to walk its trails. Gifford Pinchot preached the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. But he did it from a chateau that served maybe 50 guests per summer, all carefully selected from the same educated, wealthy East Coast elite who already had access to every other privilege America offered. This wasn't a contradiction Gifford ever fully resolved. He genuinely believed in democratic conservation, in national forests that would be protected for all Americans, in government management of natural resources for the public good. But he also believed that only educated experts like himself could be trusted to make the decisions about how those resources should be managed. He wanted to save the forests from the greedy lumber companies, but he didn't necessarily trust ordinary Americans to save them either. His was a kind of aristocratic progressivism, conservation from the top down, imposed by well-meaning elites on a public that wasn't always asking for their help. Mary Pinchot, James's wife and Gifford's mother, played a crucial role in shaping the estate's identity, though history has often overlooked her contributions. She was a talented musician, a sophisticated hostess, and a woman who understood that influence in turn-of-the-century America often flowed through social networks rather than official channels. Mary made Grey Towers socially significant, ensuring that the right people, senators, scientists, writers, foreign visitors, came to Milford, saw what the Pinchots were accomplishing, and went home to spread the gospel of conservation. She hosted Theodore Roosevelt before he was president, and maintained the connection after he entered the White House, creating the social bridge that allowed her son to become one of the most influential conservation figures in American history. But Mary also carried the burden of maintaining Grey Towers as both home and institution, and as she aged, that burden became increasingly heavy. She watched the estate consume more and more resources, demand more and more attention, and she began to wonder, quietly, whether the dream her husband had built could survive him. James Pinchot died in 1908, and with his death, the first cracks appeared in Grey Tower's foundation, not the literal stone foundation, but the financial and philosophical foundation that had kept the entire enterprise running. The crisis didn't come all at once. It came in waves, each one eroding a little more of the certainty that Grey Towers would endure forever, as the Pinchots had imagined it. The first wave was James Pinchot's death in 1908. He had been the financial anchor, the one who could simply write checks when the estate needed repairs, when the staff demanded raises, when some new conservation experiment required funding. His wealth had seemed infinite because he never forced anyone to confront its limits. With James gone, Mary and Gifford inherited not just an estate, but an enormous ongoing expense. The mansion still needed heating in winter, the roof still needed repairs after storms, the forest management still required foresters and equipment. But now those costs had to come from investment income and Gifford's government salary as chief of the Forest Service, which, while respectable, wasn't anywhere near enough to maintain Grey Towers in the style to which the Pinchot family had become accustomed. Mary, now a widow, found herself managing an estate that had been designed for a wealthy couple with unlimited resources, not for a woman alone trying to preserve her late husband's vision on a fixed income. The second wave came with World War I. During the war years, labor became scarce and expensive as young men enlisted or moved to cities for factory work. The staff that had kept Grey Towers running smoothly either left for better opportunities or demanded wages the estate could barely afford. At the same time, operating costs soared. Coal prices spiked, food became more expensive, and the federal government imposed new taxes on large estates to help fund the war effort. The genteel world of pre-war America, where wealthy families could maintain country estates with minimal interference from the government and where domestic labor was cheap and plentiful, was disappearing. Mary Pinchot, now in her 70s, scaled back operations. Fewer guests were invited, rooms in the mansion were closed off to save heating costs, the grounds were maintained but not quite as meticulously. Grey Towers began the slow, painful transition from showplace to merely impressive, from perfect to good enough. The third wave was the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the investment income that had sustained Grey Towers largely evaporated. Gifford Pinchot, by then a former Forest Service chief who had served 2 terms as Pennsylvania's governor, had his own family to support. He had married Cornelia Bryce in 1914, and they had a son, Gifford Bryce Pinchot, born in 1915. The younger Gifford would eventually inherit Grey Towers, but not the fortune that had built it. The Pinchot wealth, like so many fortunes of that era, was tied up in stocks, bonds, and real estate investments that lost massive value during the Depression. The family wasn't poor, they were still rich by any reasonable standard, But they were no longer rich enough to casually absorb the five-figure annual costs of maintaining a 44-room mansion and its surrounding estate. Difficult conversations began. Could they sell Grey Towers? But to whom and for what? The market for elaborate country estates had collapsed. The very wealthy who might have afforded such a property were the ones hit hardest by the Depression. And even if a buyer could be found, could the Pinchots morally sell the birthplace of American forestry, the place where so many important conservation decisions had been made, to some unknown purchaser who might tear it down or turn it into a resort? Mary Pinchot died in 1934, and her death marked the end of Grey Towers as a true family home. Gifford still visited, still used the estate for meetings and retreats, but he couldn't afford to maintain it year-round. The mansion was winterized and opened only during the summer months. More staff were let go. The elaborate gardens that had once required teams of gardeners were simplified. The demonstration forests were still managed, but now by Yale forestry students who used the property for summer field work, not by the permanent staff of professional foresters the estate had once employed. Grey Towers was becoming what so many great American estates became during the Depression: a burden, a beautiful weight, a monument to a vanished era that the present could no longer support. Gifford Pinchot died in 1946, and the estate passed to his widow, Cornelia, and their son, Gifford Bryce. And now the question became urgent. What do you do with an inheritance you can't afford to keep? Cornelia and Gifford Bryce faced a choice that countless American families were facing in the mid-20th century: cling to the past and risk financial ruin, or adapt to the present and sacrifice the original dream. They could try to maintain Grey Towers exactly as James and Mary had imagined it, but that would mean pouring money they didn't have into an endless maintenance cycle, probably ending in bankruptcy and forced sale. They could sell the estate outright, but that felt like betraying everything the family had worked for. Or they could find a third option, something that would preserve Grey Towers' legacy while releasing the family from its impossible financial burden. That third option arrived in the form of the United States Forest Service. The Forest Service, which Gifford Pinchot had founded and led, wanted Grey Towers. They wanted it as a symbol, as a training facility, as a living monument to their first chief in the conservation movement he had championed. They were willing to take ownership of the entire estate, assume all maintenance costs, restore the mansion to its original grandeur, and operate it as a national historic site open to the public. In return, the Pinchot family would get nothing. No payment, no ongoing compensation, just the satisfaction of knowing that Grey Towers would be preserved and that their family's legacy would be protected by the federal government. On the surface, this looks like a generous gift, an act of patriotic philanthropy. And in many ways, it was. But let's be clear about what was really happening. The Pinchot family was offloading an enormously expensive asset that they could no longer afford to maintain. They were transforming a private liability into a public monument, ensuring that taxpayers would fund the preservation of their family legacy in perpetuity. Yes, they gave up ownership, but what they owned had become more burden than privilege. The mansion required hundreds of thousands of dollars in immediate repairs. The roof was failing, the stone walls needed repointing, the plumbing and electrical systems were obsolete and dangerous. The forest, while still impressive, needed professional management that the family couldn't provide. By donating Grey Towers to the Forest Service, the Pinchots ensured that the government would spend millions of dollars over the coming decades to restore and maintain the estate, money the family no longer had and couldn't have raised. This wasn't failure. This was a brilliant adaptation, a recognition that some legacies are too important to be sustained by private wealth alone, that the only way to save Grey Towers was to make it America's problem instead of the Pinchot family's problem. The donation ceremony in 1963 was attended by Forest Service officials, politicians, and conservation leaders who praised the Pinchot family's generosity. Cornelia Pinchot, now in her 70s, stood on the lawn where her mother-in-law had once hosted Theodore Roosevelt and handed the keys to a government representative. Photos from that day show her smiling, gracious, playing the role of the magnanimous donor. But if you look closely at those images, At the expressions of the family members in the background, you can see something else: relief. The weight was finally lifting. Gray Towers would endure, but someone else would pay for it. The Pinchots would be remembered as the family that gave away their most precious possession for the good of the nation, when the truth was more complicated and more human. They gave it away because keeping it would have destroyed them, financially and emotionally. They gave it away because the dream their grandfather had built in 1886 had become unsustainable by 1963. Because the world had changed and the economics of maintaining grand estates had shifted irrevocably. The donation of Gray Towers wasn't an ending. It was a pivot, a pragmatic solution to an impossible problem, and perhaps the most conservation-minded decision the Pinchots ever made, recognizing when to let go. Today, if you visit Gray Towers National Historic Site, you'll find an estate that looks much as it did in the early 20th century. The federal government invested heavily in restoration after taking ownership, hiring historical architects to repair the stone towers, landscape experts to recreate the gardens, and conservators to preserve the furnishings and artifacts the Pinchot family left behind. The letterbox and finger bowl have been restored. The demonstration forests are managed according to modern sustainable forestry principles, and the mansion's 44 rooms are open for tours during the summer months. Approximately 20,000 visitors per year make the journey to Milford to walk the grounds, tour the house, and learn about Gifford Pinchot's role in creating America's national forest system. The Pinchot Institute for Conservation, founded in 1963, operates from Gray Towers, conducting research and education programs that continue the family's mission. In this sense, the donation worked exactly as intended. Gray Towers survived. The legacy was preserved. The story has a happy ending. But let's answer the question I posed at the beginning. Can you build a dynasty on trees you'll never see grow? Can a vision planted by one generation survive the storms that come for the next? The answer Gray Towers gives us is, only if you're willing to let it transform into something you never intended. James Pinchot built Gray Towers as a private estate, a family seat, a place where the Pinchot name would be permanently engraved into the Pennsylvania landscape. He imagined generations of Pinchots living there, managing the forests, hosting the nation's conservation leaders, maintaining an unbroken link between the family and the American environmental movement. That didn't happen. The estate survived, but only by ceasing to be what James Pinchot had imagined. It became public property, a museum, a government facility. The Pinchot name is everywhere at Gray Towers, but no Pinchots live there. The dream survived, but the dynasty did not. And maybe that's the real lesson of Gray Towers. Maybe the most successful legacies are the ones that learn to outlive their creator's original intentions. James Pinchot wanted to save America's forests, and in that, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His son Gifford helped establish 150 million acres of national forests, fundamentally changing how Americans think about natural resources and conservation. Gray Towers played a crucial role in that transformation, serving as the laboratory where early conservation principles were developed and tested. But James also wanted to establish a family dynasty, and in that, he failed. The costs of maintaining Gray Towers in the style he envisioned were simply too high for his descendants to bear. The mansion consumed resources faster than the family could regenerate them, much like the forests Gifford Pinchot fought to protect. The irony is almost too perfect. The birthplace of sustainable forestry turned out to be itself unsustainable as a private family estate. Yet, here's what persists: the ideas. When you walk the trails at Gray Towers today, when you stand in the library where Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt debated forest policy, when you see the carefully managed woodlands that demonstrate what American forests could look like if we treated them as long-term investments rather than short-term resources, you're experiencing the part of James Pinchot's vision that did survive. The physical estate required the federal government to preserve it, but the intellectual and philosophical legacy needed no such rescue. It was already embedded in American law, in the Forest Service's management principles, in the very existence of the National Forest System. Gray Towers taught us that you don't have to own something to love it, that private vision can become public good, and that sometimes the price of preservation is surrender. The Pinchots learned what many wealthy families learn eventually, that no amount of money can permanently preserve a lifestyle, that change is the only constant, and that the best way to ensure your values outlive you is to build them into institutions larger than your family. The greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. That was Gifford Pinchot's utilitarian principle for forest management, but it applies equally well to Grey Towers itself. The estate stopped serving the greatest good when it was a private mansion serving one family. It began serving the greatest good when it became a public monument serving the nation. The Pinchot family's wealth couldn't sustain their dream indefinitely, but America's collective investment could. By letting go, the Pinchots ensured that their vision would serve the greatest number for the longest possible time. That's not failure, that's conservation in its truest form. It's recognizing that some things are too valuable to be owned, too important to be kept private, and too expensive to be maintained by any single family. Grey Towers was built by private wealth to teach public lessons, and in the end, it had to become fully public to survive. The mansion that built America's forests could only be saved by the government that those forests made possible. So what is the true cost of immortality? If James Pinchot were here today to see Grey Towers bustling with tourists, filled with researchers from the Pinchot Institute hosting educational programs for school children learning about conservation, would he consider the trade worth it? He lost his family dynasty, but he gained something possibly more valuable: permanent relevance. His name isn't just remembered, it's institutionalized. The ideas he imported from Europe and planted in Pennsylvania soil have grown into a forest of policy, law, and public consciousness that shapes how Americans interact with nature. That forest required sacrifice to survive. It required his descendants to give up their inheritance, to transform private glory into public good, to accept that the price of making history is sometimes losing control of your own story. Grey Tower stands today as proof that the most enduring legacies are the ones willing to adapt, to change form, to accept that survival sometimes means becoming something your creator never imagined. The trees James and Gifford Pinchot planted are now mature forests. They outlived their planters, as all good trees should. And Grey Towers itself has done the same, outliving the family that built it by transforming into something larger, stranger, and more democratic than a private château on a Pennsylvania hilltop. It became a metaphor made real, that conservation isn't about holding on, it's about letting go in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, so that what you love can continue without you. There's one more layer to this story that we need to examine before we close the book on Grey Towers, because the transformation from private estate to public monument wasn't the end of the evolution. It was merely another chapter in an ongoing negotiation between idealism and reality. When the Forest Service took ownership in 1963, they inherited not just a mansion and 45 acres of land, but also an obligation to maintain Grey Towers as a living monument to conservation while making it accessible to a public that was changing rapidly. The 1960s and 70s brought a new environmental movement, one that was younger, more radical, and sometimes at odds with Gifford Pinchot's utilitarian conservation philosophy. The new environmentalists, inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the first Earth Day in 1970, didn't just want managed forests. They wanted wilderness, ecosystems left entirely alone, nature preserved for its own sake rather than for human use. Grey Towers, with its carefully manicured demonstration forests and its emphasis on sustainable timber harvesting, suddenly seemed almost quaint, a relic of an earlier, more anthropocentric approach to environmental protection. The Forest Service faced a dilemma. How do you honor a conservation pioneer whose methods are being questioned by a new generation of activists? How do you run a historic site that celebrates scientific forestry when many visitors are coming with a preservationist mindset that sees any tree cutting as vandalism? The answer, once again, was adaptation. Grey Towers began hosting conferences and symposia that brought together different schools of environmental thought: old guard foresters and new wave ecologists, timber industry representatives and wilderness advocates, government officials and grassroots activists. The estate became a neutral ground, a place where competing visions of environmental stewardship could be debated in the same rooms where Gifford Pinchot had once held court. The Pinchot Institute for Conservation, established on the grounds, deliberately positioned itself as a bridge between utilitarian conservation and preservation philosophy, conducting research that acknowledged the value of both approaches. Grey Towers evolved from a monument to one man's vision into a forum for ongoing conversation about how humans should relate to the natural world. This wasn't what James Pinchot had imagined when he built his château in 1886, and it probably wasn't what Gifford envisioned when he pioneered American forestry, but it was what the 21st century needed. Walk through Grey Towers today, and you'll notice something interesting in how the National Park Service and Forest Service interpret the site for visitors. The tours don't present Gifford Pinchot as a flawless hero or his conservation philosophy as the final word in environmental wisdom. Instead, they contextualize him as a product of his time, a progressive reformer who genuinely wanted to protect forests, but who also had blind spots, particularly regarding indigenous people's relationship with the land and the value of wilderness untouched by human management. The interpretive materials acknowledge that the Pinchot's wealth came from industrial capitalism, the same economic system that was destroying the forests they sought to protect. They note that Grey Towers itself, despite being a demonstration of sustainable forestry, was built on a model of resource consumption that only the very wealthy could afford and that couldn't possibly be scaled to serve all Americans. This kind of nuanced historical interpretation is itself a form of adaptation, recognizing that the value of Grey Towers isn't in presenting an idealized past, but in honestly grappling with the contradictions, compromises, and complexities that have always defined American conservation. The mansion's physical condition also tells a story of ongoing negotiation. Despite the federal government's commitment to preservation, Grey Towers requires constant maintenance that strains even public budgets. The stone towers themselves, exposed to Pennsylvania's harsh winters and humid summers, need regular repointing to prevent water infiltration. The slate roof, while beautiful and historically appropriate, is enormously expensive to maintain and requires specialized craftsmen whose skills are increasingly rare. The heating and cooling systems must balance the needs of preserving historic artifacts with the comfort of modern visitors and staff. Every few years, a major repair project emerges. The stone terrace needs stabilization, the windows require restoration, the foundation shows signs of settling, and the Forest Service must make difficult decisions about where to allocate limited preservation funds. Should they spend $200,000 repairing the letterbox's reflecting pool system, or should that money go toward maintaining trails and facilities at national forests where millions of Americans actually recreate? Should they restore the mansion's third-floor servants' quarters to historically accurate conditions, or should those rooms be converted into modern office space for the Pinchot Institute's researchers? These aren't theoretical questions. They're the daily reality of managing a historic estate in an era of tight government budgets and competing priorities. What's fascinating is that these financial pressures mirror exactly the challenges the Pinchot family faced. The federal government, with all its resources, still struggles to maintain Grey Towers without compromise. The estate is still expensive, still demanding, still requiring difficult choices about what to preserve and what to let go. The difference is that the government can spread those costs across millions of taxpayers and justify them as serving the public good in ways the Pinchot family never could. But the fundamental problem remains. Grand visions are expensive to maintain, and expenses compound over time. Every generation must decide anew whether the investment is worth it, whether the symbolic and educational value of Grey Towers justifies the ongoing cost, whether this particular monument serves a purpose important enough to claim resources that could be used elsewhere. So far, the answer has been yes, but that answer isn't guaranteed forever. It requires active recommitment from each new generation of Americans who must decide what their past is worth preserving. Here's what Grey Towers ultimately teaches us about legacy, about conservation, about the relationship between private dreams and public memory. Nothing survives unchanged. Not forests, not families, not fortunes, not philosophies. The gray towers still stand on their Pennsylvania hilltop, but they mean something different to visitors in the 21st century than they meant to the Gilded Age elite who walked their halls in 1900. The forests surrounding the estate are still there, still managed, but according to principles that have evolved far beyond what Gifford Pinchot would recognize. The Pinchot name endures, but attached to institutions and ideas rather than to a living family dynasty. This is how history works, not as preservation in amber, but as continuous transformation, each generation reinterpreting the artifacts and ideas it inherits, keeping what seems useful and letting the rest quietly fade away. James Pinchot built gray towers to be timeless, but its actual value lies in how well it has adapted to time, how successfully it has evolved from private monument to public resource to ongoing conversation about what we owe the past and what we owe the future. The trees that Gifford Pinchot planted in the demonstration forests around gray towers are now over a century old. Some have been selectively harvested according to the sustainable forestry principles he pioneered. Some have died naturally and been left to decompose, returning nutrients to the soil. New trees have grown in the gaps, creating a forest that is both ancient and young, continuous and constantly changing. That's the real metaphor for gray towers and the legacy it represents. Conservation isn't about freezing things in perfect stasis. It's about creating systems resilient enough to absorb change, adapt to new conditions, and continue serving their core purpose even as the details shift. The Pinchot family couldn't keep gray towers exactly as James built it, but by letting go of that dream, they ensured the estate would continue, serving its deeper mission, teaching Americans about their relationship with the natural world. The form changed, from private estate to public monument to active research and education center, but the function persisted. That's not compromise, that's wisdom. That's understanding the difference between the vision you can control and the legacy you can't. If you visit gray towers on a quiet autumn afternoon, after most of the tourists have left, you can stand on the stone terrace and look out over the Delaware Valley just as James Pinchot must have done in the 1890s. Just as Gifford Pinchot did when he was developing the ideas that would reshape American forestry, just as Theodore Roosevelt did when he came to discuss the future of the nation's natural resources. The view hasn't changed that much. The hills are still forested, the river still flows, the sky still arcs overhead in that particular Pennsylvania blue. But everything else has changed. The forests you're looking at are protected by laws that didn't exist when James Pinchot stood on this terrace. They're managed by professionals trained in techniques that Gifford Pinchot helped pioneer, but that have evolved far beyond his original principles. They're valued by a public that has learned, slowly and incompletely, that some things can't be reduced to immediate economic utility, that there's worth in long-term thinking and sustainability. That learning process started here, at Gray Towers, in this mansion that was too expensive to keep but too important to lose. And it continues here still, in a building that survives only because it learned to transform, to adapt, to become something larger and stranger than its creator imagined. Not a dynasty, but a conversation. Not a monument to one family, but a mirror in which America can see itself grappling with questions that have no final answers. How do we live with nature without destroying it? How do we preserve the past without being imprisoned by it? How do we honor the vision of previous generations while adapting to challenges they never imagined? Gray Towers doesn't answer these questions. It just keeps asking them year after year, stone tower against changing sky, waiting for each new generation to arrive and try their hand at solving problems that can never be fully solved, only continuously renegotiated. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into the mansion that taught America how to save its forests while struggling to save itself, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. These detailed historical stories take considerable time and research to produce, and your support through likes, subscriptions, and comments makes them possible. I'm genuinely curious. Which other American estates, families, or conservation landmarks would you like me to investigate next? Should I explore Biltmore and the Vanderbilts' complicated relationship with Appalachian forests, the Rockefellers' creation of Acadia National Park and the price they paid for preservation? Or perhaps the strange story of how wealthy industrialists became America's most unlikely environmental heroes, and whether their conservation efforts were redemption or just another form of control. Let me know in the comments below what story you think needs to be told. Understanding the past helps us navigate the present, and stories like Gray Towers remind us that even the most idealistic visions require practical solutions to survive. The tension between private dreams and public good, between family legacy and national heritage, between the cost of preservation and the price of letting go. These aren't just historical questions. They're challenges every generation faces in different forms, whether you're managing a national park, running a small farm, or simply trying to leave something meaningful behind for those who come after you. Gray Towers stands today because people made hard choices to adapt instead of cling, to share instead of hoard, to accept transformation instead of demanding permanence. That's the lesson worth remembering as we face our own era of environmental challenges, as we debate how to preserve what's left of our natural world while making it accessible to all Americans, as we try to balance competing visions of what conservation should mean in the 21st century. The Pinchot family learned that some inheritances are too expensive to keep but too valuable to abandon. They found a third way, imperfect and complicated, that allowed their dream to survive by becoming everyone's dream. Maybe that's the only way grand visions ever endure, by escaping the control of their creators and becoming something messier, more democratic, and ultimately more resilient than any private legacy could ever be. Thank you for watching this investigation into Gray Towers and the Pinchot family's complicated legacy. Your engagement with these stories keeps history alive and relevant, ensures that the lessons learned by previous generations aren't lost, and reminds us that the questions we face today have been grappled with before, by people who were just as uncertain and just as determined as we are. I'll see you in the next investigation, where we'll uncover more hidden truths behind the grand facades of America's most fascinating estates and the families who built them, loved them, and ultimately had to let them go.